Okay, let's quickly talk about accounts receivable and more specifically how to handle uncollectible accounts. This is a really important area in accounting because we want to make sure our financial statements are as accurate as possible. And if we're extending credit, more than likely some customers aren't going to pay us, so we need to be able to show the amount that we estimate will become uncollectible. And usually we can estimate that amount based on prior experience, perhaps industry averages, what's going on in the economy, things like that. So there's two methods we can use to account for uncollectible accounts. The first one is direct write-off method, which is not GAAP, so really we shouldn't be using it. And the second is the allowance method. So let's real quickly run through the direct write-off method, which again is not GAAP. Basically, we're waiting here until the account becomes uncollectible, at which time we write it off. The reason this is not GAAP is because it gives us no idea when we look at our financial statements as to the amount that may become uncollectible. So we may see $1 million worth of receivables on our balance sheet, but if $200,000 of that is not going to be collected, we need to account for that somehow. And direct write-off method does not allow us to do that. But essentially, we wait till the customer's account becomes uncollectible, we debit bad debt expense, and we credit the customer's account. That's how we would write off the customer's account under direct write-off method. Now let's say the customer decides to pay us. That happens quite frequently because sometimes genuinely the customer has a legitimate reason for not paying. They just need to get the money and they will pay us. At which time we would reverse the entry that we just made. So we debit the customer's account, credit bad debt expense. That's going to put that account back on our books for $200. And then we debit cash and credit the customer's account just like they would make any other payment if they decide to pay us. And this actually will be the same sort of scenario under the allowance method as well. Now I mentioned to you direct write-off method is not GAAP because it doesn't adhere to the matching principle. Again, we have no idea of actual amount of receivables that will become collectible under direct write-off method. So only small non-public companies who have very small amounts of bad debt could use this. So let's look at the allowance method. Now the allowance method is going to allow us to estimate an amount of bad debt expense in the same period when we make the sale. So if, for example, we know on average that 2% of our sales become uncollectible, we're going to account for that in the same period when we make the sale. So when we actually see our amount on our balance sheet for the accounts receivable, we'll get a net amount, the amount that we actually expect to be received from our customers, which makes it much more accurate. So what we do is we debit bad debt expense. That expense will come off in the same period when we make the sale, which will help us with our matching principle, which is what is required under GAAP. And we will set up a new account called an allowance for uncollectible accounts. Sometimes it's also called an allowance for bad debt. It's what's a contra asset account tied to our accounts receivable. So on our balance sheet, we will see accounts receivable, the entire amount, say $1 million. Then we would see less allowance for uncollectible accounts, $200,000. So that would mean that we expect to receive $800,000 in receivables. That gives us a much better idea of the amounts that we're actually going to be receiving. And again, ways we can determine those amounts: past experience, how the economy is doing, industry methods. And there's two allowance methods that we use. One is percentage of sales, and the other one is the aging method of accounts receivable. Percentage of sales is pretty straightforward. We just look at our current period sales, multiply that times an estimated bad debt percentage, and then we get an estimated bad debt expense. We debit bad debt expense for that amount and credit the allowance for doubtful accounts or allowance for uncollectible accounts. Those are the same. Some textbooks say doubtful, some say uncollectible. So. And then in this example, our sales were $800,000. We had a 1% bad debt expense percentage. Multiply those two together, that's $8,000. Debit your bad debt expense, credit your allowance for doubtful accounts. Then when we write off the customer's account, we actually debit the allowance account and credit the customer's account. So we're in a way we're setting up a pool of money which we can draw from when we have our debts go bad. So that allowance, that contra asset, is going to be not technically, but you can think of it as monies that we're setting aside to cover our bad debt when they come due. And then again, if the customer decides to pay, we go ahead and reverse the entry that we just made, debit cash, credit accounts receivable, to record the payment. Now under percentage of receivables, it's slightly different than the percentage of sales. Percentage of sales, very straightforward. Percentage of receivables, an extra step that we have to do, and you have to pay extra careful attention to this part that's highlighted in blue. It says the amount of the adjusting entry is the difference between the required balance and the existing balance in the allowance account. So I'll walk through an example with you. So one way we can calculate percentage of receivables is to take our balance in accounts receivable and multiply it times some percent that we become uncollectible. Another way that companies do this is through an aging of accounts receivable, and it makes a lot of sense actually. So if you think about it, the longer an account becomes past due, the less likely we are to collect on that account. So for example, in this scenario, accounts that are over 90 days past due, this company determines to be 60% uncollectible. And again, these amounts will vary depending on the company. So we multiply that balance, those monies that are over 90 days past due, times the percentage uncollectible, and that'll give us an estimated uncollectible amount. And we'll do that for each of our categories of past due payments. Add all those up and we get 5320 in this case. So 5320 we estimate will become uncollectible out of the $100,000 in receivables that we have. Now here's the tricky part. So that 5320 becomes the ending balance that we need in our allowance account. That is not the amount that we debit and credit for bad debt expense. We have to look then at what our initial balance was in our allowance account, or the current balance in our allowance account. In this case it was $900. Then we have that 5320 is what we need in there, so we have to make an adjustment. In this case, the difference between 5320 and 900 is 4420. Debit bad debt expense for 4420, credit our allowance for doubtful accounts 4420. So just to give you a quick idea of what your balance sheet will actually look like, you'll see your accounts receivable for this company is $32,000. They have an allowance for uncollectible accounts of $1767. So their accounts receivable net, the amount that we actually expect to collect, is $30,233. You can also see it shown sometimes like this, accounts receivable net, where they're not showing you the breakdown of the two, but rather you'll just see the amount that they expect to become collectible. Thank you.